Donc, bonsoir à tous. Donc, bienvenue à cette cinquième séance du séminaire de géopolitique du risque consacré cette année à l'éthique de l'incertitude. And I'm going to speak English. Well, this is going to be English session, so we can just get started with that part right away. And I'm really happy to welcome Professor Stefan Elbe and Dagmar Vorlicek, whom I'm going to introduce in a moment. Make sure everybody's here. As usual, nods. There we go. Welcome, welcome. As usual, a word about last week's session, and then maybe some speculative ideas about tonight's session. I'm speaking English, as you can hear, and this means, as well, here from the naughty kids, yes. But please feel free to intervene in French or English, and we'll do what we need to do to translate. Last time, that's the 12th of October, we had a session on le tournant digital en aide humanitaire, the digital wave in humanitarian aid, with Marielle Devaux and Monique Berly. And we discussed, among other things, the idea of the biological person and the clash of this biological person with what we traditionally would call humanity or the human. And in particular, Marielle Devaux was interested in the term solutionism, which was inspired by this book by Eugene Morozov, entitled, what is it entitled? It's entitled, Click Here to Save Everything. I think that's it, huh? Click Here to Save Everything. And we talked about the vulnerabilities created by this idea of solutionism. And solutionism, Marielle Devaux defined as, in a relatively straightforward, simple way, as taking recourse to technologies almost automatically to solve the problems of society. And immediately is presented the clash there again between society as a supposedly human construction and technology as something non-human or less human. And that's just the interesting part of the question. To what degree can there be continuity between the human and the technological, and the social and the technological? That led us a little bit later on to the concept of digital colonialism, the degree to which digital technologies can be adapted to work in humanitarian contexts in the South. We also talked about biometrics in general and the use of biometrics in humanitarian aid. We evoked the work of Shoshana Zuboff, the surveillance capitalism, the concept of surveillance capitalism. And we spoke then about the uncertainties connected to surveillance capitalism and revisited the question of solutionism in that context. Is Africa, because that's the terrain of interest of Marielle Devaux, is it an exception? Is there some sort of overarching logic which connects the technologies of the North with the actual boots on the ground situation in the South? Or is there, again, one more time, a clash? And then finally, we discussed the idea of democracy and whether democracy could now be viable when it's being increasingly represented by digital technologies and put into practice through digital tools. So if we understand democracy as a problem of a cultural, social, let's even say spiritual problem, then to what degree is it interrupted or made problematic by the use and the widespread use of digital technologies and the belief that digital technologies are the solution to our problems. Today, then we're going to approach the problem of technology and humanity, if you like, or technology and health, the material and the immaterial from a different perspective, perhaps even a very different perspective. And the point of entry now is going to be infrastructure. On the one hand, of course, infrastructure is the most concrete, material, inanimate, inhuman, unsocial substance you can imagine. And yet, we rely on infrastructure to do the work of healthcare, and increasingly at a distance in global terms to do wide-ranging work of healthcare. And the question here again becomes something like, what is the continuity between health, global health, and the material technologies we put at their service? So infrastructure is the least human from a certain point of view. We'll see if we can unpack or deconstruct this inhuman conception of the infrastructure. I think we're going to probably, just guessing, knowing our guests from this evening, I think we're going to do that. So but in the first cut, the first level, we can say that infrastructure and the social, infrastructure and health are widely opposed. They're contradictory. And then we come to see that in some ways they come together, they nourish one another, and the infrastructural becomes far more social, and the social becomes, weirdly enough, more and more infrastructural. So critical infrastructure also, I might add, I don't know if you're going to talk about this, we'll see, but I've studied it and written about critical infrastructure in my past, and asked why critical infrastructure is critical for society. What makes a technology, a material reality, critical for something which is so immaterial like a society? So what are the human benefits of infrastructure? What are the human benefits of critical infrastructure? And perhaps the most human benefit is health security. What's the humanity of health security? Where is it interfered with by infrastructure? Where is it supported by infrastructure? Where is the link that's cultural, social, and again, spiritual? I'm guessing, essentially, what might be said. Some of the questions that are inspired me to invite our two guests, and let me present them right now. Stefan Elbe is Professor of International Relations and Director of the Center for Global Health Policy at the University of Sussex. He has served many significant roles in international relations in Europe and in the world, including head of the International Relations Department and Director of Research for the School of Global Studies at the University of Sussex. He was also the founding chair of the Global Health section of the International Studies Association and founding co-convener of the Global Health Working Group of the British International Studies Association. He's published widely. I've followed him, his career since he was just a young man, and he's probably going to tell the usual joke that he tells. I'll let him tell it about our friendship in the early days. His most recent book is Pandemic Pills and Politics Governing Global Health Security. There are many others I'll leave to the side. And then his most recent article, Bioinformational Diplomacy, Global Health Emergencies, Data Sharing, and Sequential Life. Dagmar Vorlicek, who's here beside me, is postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Sociology at the University of Vienna, co-founder of the European International Studies Association section, Science, Technology, and Security. Why did it take so long? And she's now head of the board of the Institute of International Relations in Prague, from where she just flew in. We're very grateful for that. And a member of the executive board and of the Central and East European International Studies Association. She was previously lecturer in global insecurities at the University of Sussex, not far from Stefan Elbe, and Marie Curie Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Vienna. Her research explores the entanglements of science, technology, and global insecurities, while drawing on international relations, science and technology studies, and political sociology. She's published on bioweapons, biobanks, dual-use research, and Global Health, and recently published an article in Security Dialogue entitled Governing Dual-Use Knowledge from the Politics of Responsible Science to the Ethicalization of Security. Both Stefan Elbe and Dagmar Vorlicek are old friends, good colleagues. I'm really grateful that they decided to join us. As usual, we'll have two 30-minute presentations, starting with Stefan Elbe, and then there'll be time for discussion, questions, comments, as we may deem necessary. So Stefan, the floor is yours. And I just muted you, sorry. Nothing personal.
Okay, can you hear me, Peter?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Peter, for the kind invitation to present this evening. Everybody should know Peter is one of my very favorite colleagues in the field and in the discipline, so it's always a pleasure to reconnect. And I won't tell the joke, Peter, just to say that Peter and I go back a very long time, so long ago that I still remember Peter having beautiful, long, blonde hair while he was reminiscing in the texts of Hegel. So that's how far back we go. Also, my apologies at the outset that I'm unable to speak in French today. I did actually take French at school, but I never reached a level good enough to give me the confidence to speak in French this evening. So thank you for allowing me to speak in English. Before I get into my my kind of half hour on infrastructure, I just want to take a couple minutes to set the scene a little bit more broadly. Health has been in the news a lot, so obviously you know, it won't take long, but I'd like to just take a few minutes to set the scene for the seminar today, because we are, of course, dealing with one particular type of risk, a risk that does also have geopolitical implications, and that's the risk of new infectious disease outbreaks. And in the kind of Anglosphere, you know, we call this managing global health emergencies, or sometimes we call it just global health security for short. This risk or the risks around global health security are actually three different type of risks. So I'm just going to put a couple of slides on to show you these different kind of facets of global health security. So I'm just going to try and share my screen. Is that coming across?
Yes.
Brilliant. So, you know, from an international level and from the perspective of international politics, a lot of this goes back nearly 20 years ago now. So what you're looking at here is the meeting of the United Nations Security Council. And if you had to kind of find or select a date for the birth of global health security as a concept, this would probably be it. So this is the 10th of January, 2000. It's the first meeting of the United Nations Security Council in the new millennium. So it has a hugely symbolic function. And what's critical about this meeting is not just the date, but also the topic of discussion, because the council was discussing the threat that HIV/AIDS poses to international peace and security in Africa. So it was in the midst of the kind of garnering AIDS pandemic. And so it was actually the first time in the history of the council, a council set up after the Second World War, that a health issue was considered to be a threat to international peace and security. There are very many different reasons for that, impacts on the military, impacts on state stability, impacts on peacekeepers, but it's really the kind of symbolic turning point for the rise of global health security as a kind of preoccupation at the international level. With HIV/AIDS, events unfolded fairly quickly. In February 2002, we had a Chinese doctor check into this hotel in Hong Kong in Kowloon. He did not realize it at the time, but he had contracted a new coronavirus that produced severe acute respiratory syndrome. So he stayed at this hotel along with many other guests. And so within hours, this virus was traveling on the back of an international aviation infrastructure to different parts of Asia and ultimately around most of the world. Following SARS, we had a pandemic flu scare around bird flu, or H5N1, as it was called. We then had also the H1N1 or swine flu pandemic. At the end of 2013, we had a small child pictured here on the left in West Africa being bitten by a bat and becoming the first kind of index case of the biggest Ebola outbreak in history, just found in West Africa between 2013 and 2016. Like HIV/AIDS, Ebola had to end up going to the United Nations Security Council in order to muster a kind of international response. And of course, as we all know, we've had the COVID outbreak over recent years. So we've really had, over the past 20 years, a whole epidemic of naturally occurring outbreaks. And this is one major axis or driver of global health security. That's one major risk. But it's not the only one. So I want to take you back to 2001 and September 2001 and back to the East Coast of the United States. And you can see here 3 mailboxes. And so not in New York, but in Trenton, New Jersey, about 100 miles south of New York. And about a week after 9/11, somebody deposited 3 letters into these mailboxes. The letters were addressed to prominent people in the US media and in politics. They were made to look like they're quite innocent letters. If you look at the one on the left, all the way in the top left-hand corner, I don't know if you can read it. The return address is a elementary school, a 4th grade class. So it looked like children had written these letters. But of course, when the letters were opened, they contained threatening messages and also a white powder that later turned out to be anthrax, and that caused several deaths and infections, led to a shutting down of the US government at the highest level, and also, of course, created widespread fear and panic. So it's a very good illustration of the second kind of risk linked to infectious disease outbreaks, which is the risk of a deliberate use or a weaponization of disease. And this comes in a context where it is the stated aims of some political groups to actually proactively develop biological weapons, and also in a context where, of course, the ability, the technologies, the knowledges of how to manipulate life, even at a kind of molecular scale, are proliferating rapidly. So it's not just naturally occurring outbreaks, it's also the threat of a deliberate outbreak. Increasingly, we also have a third axis or dimension of global health security, and that is the prospect of an accidental release. So it's a simple fact that around the world, there are more and more laboratories that are dealing with dangerous pathogens. These could be traditional kind of military or state laboratories, but it could also be commercial laboratories or even just university kind of laboratories. And so we also know that accidents happen throughout history. And so increasing, there's also growing concern how one might prevent an accidental release from a laboratory. So global health security, what we're talking about today, it's really 3 things: threat of naturally occurring outbreaks, threat of a deliberate use of a biological weapon, and also accidental release from a laboratory. Now, when we're looking at this big field of global health security, there are many different things you can look at. You can look at the kind of norms and the legal instruments that states are designing to respond to this. Countries around the world at the moment are negotiating around a new pandemic instrument or a new pandemic treaty. You can look at different surveillance technologies and mechanisms, how you can spot outbreaks more quickly. You can look at, the complicated processes through which new medicines and vaccines are developed during an emergency. There are many different things you could look at within this field, and that we have looked at in the past, and I've spoken about in the past in this seminar series. But what Dagmar and I would like to focus on today really is, and Peter said it already, is the notion of infrastructure. So within the social sciences, there's a growing recognition that infrastructures are important, but often overlooked. So there are many different infrastructures that, as Peter said, are critical to the running of societies. You have infrastructures for water, for heating, for electricity, for conducting traffic, electricity, roads, trains, etc. But often these infrastructures are kind of quietly running in the background and they don't receive a lot of attention. They usually, in fact, only receive sustained attention when something goes terribly wrong and an infrastructure breaks or fails catastrophically, creating kind of wider social problems. And so what Dagmar and I would like to do today is, in a sense, almost do like a reversal or an inversion, and to actually, rather than keeping infrastructure in the background, put infrastructure in the foreground to center and focus on infrastructure. And Dagmar and I are both going to do this in different ways today. So let me give you a definition of infrastructure. There are many different definitions in the infrastructure, but here's one, an influential one from Brian Larkin. And what Dagmar and I are going to do today is I'm going to spend the first half hour speaking about one type of infrastructure, which are emergency operation centers. And Dagmar is going to speak about biosecurity laboratories. And the things that I would like you to think about during our talks are, what exactly are these infrastructures in the field of global health security? What role do they play? And what difference do they ultimately make? So I want to start now with one set of infrastructures that are called emergency operations centers. Okay, so the terminology varies a little bit. Sometimes they're called public health emergency operations centers. Sometimes they're called strategic health operations centers. But these are all just different ways of referring to the same thing. And these EOCs are essentially the global health equivalent of war rooms, right? So many of you may recall from World War II or from history, right, that whenever there's a big battle or there's a big conflict or a big war, there's usually kind of a central bunker or room where the generals and the politicians come together to take the big decisions and to kind of plot the next moves. And so global health has begun to develop similar types of infrastructures, and these are called EOCs. So these are kind of like bunker-like spatial complexes. They're usually located within health organizations rather than military organizations. And they try to bring together all the key people and data and expertise needed to respond to an infectious disease outbreak. And so, one of these can be found in Geneva. We all know that the Secretariat of the World Health Organization has its secretariat in Geneva. And so what I'm putting up here is a picture of the Emergency Operations Center in Geneva at WHO. You can see there is no natural light that comes into this room. In fact, before it was the EOC, this room was the cinema or the movie theater for the EOC, where they used to show films. But they then converted it into an EOC. You can also see it has a lot of computer screens. You can see that they electronically they can go up and down. There are data visualization screens all around the sides. There's kind of a world clock. Everybody's kind of faced or seated facing one another. There's around the side, you can't see it in this photo, they have privacy glass. So they have a glass where you can kind of look through, but somebody can flick a switch and then it goes all frosty and gray. So you can't look inside. It has other features that are not immediately obvious, like an air pressure system. So you can have an air pressure lock. It has a backup power generator. It has its own food supply. There's a lot of stuff going on around these EOCs. And so one of the things that used to happen when I would go to WHO to do interviews for my research is they say, Stefan, you have to come look at our EOC. And as I went to other public health organizations around the world, the same thing used to happen. They'd be like, Stefan, you have to come look at our EOC. And so these EOCs are also what I would like to talk about in my talk today. I'm just going to swap presentations for a second, because one of the things I've been doing as part of this project is collecting photos from different EOCs all around the world, from visits that I've done there, through to, you can find also a lot of photos online and on social media and so forth. So I'm just going to come out of this and show you some of these pictures. Okay, so hopefully this is going to very slowly start to cycle through different photos of EOCs from around the world. And the way I decided, well, actually, I think what I'm going to tell you straight at the beginning what my overall argument is going to be, and I think I can safely the argument is so complicated that I think even if I tell you right at the beginning what the argument is, it will not immediately be clear what it means. You, in a nutshell, is that these emergency operation centers prefigure global health security, and they prefigure it oligoptically. So there's a particular to argue is that there's a particular type of power that comes from these EOCs that I call oligoptical prefiguration. And if that is totally incomprehensible to you at the moment.
Sorry, Stefan.
Yeah.
Just the word polygoptical.
Oligoptical.
Oligoptical. That's much clearer.
Yeah, it comes from the Greek.
Okay.
But please don't worry if it's unclear at the moment. It's unclear by design, and I will. The part of the talk is to build it up.
Okay.
Step by step.
The presentation doesn't run, I think. Oh, it might.
I think I forgot to start. I've pressed the start the slideshow, so it should start running now. It's about a minute on each slide, so hopefully it'll start ticking over soon. So, to begin a kind of more social scientific analysis of these emergency operation centers, I turn to a body of thought that is called site ontology. Site ontology is a type of social science that is derived from philosophy, from philosophers like Martin Heidegger and Ludwig Wittgenstein. And as the name implies, the key contention of site ontology is that in order to understand transformations of social life, you really have to focus on the site. So the character and transformation of social life is closely tied to the site where it unfolds. And that's why examining sites is so crucial for site ontology. And so one of the things that the first kind of move of the argument is to say, actually, these EOCs are actually critical sites in the contemporary production and the making of global health security. So around the world, there are more than 50 of these EOCs that can now be found. There are efforts within the context of the international health regulations, which are the major kind of legal framework for responding to disease outbreaks for each country around the world to have at least one such EOCs. There are things like the Global Health Security Agenda that are trying to help countries build these EOCs. So we can think about these. I sometimes call these EOCs viral infrastructures. They are viral infrastructures because they are not exclusively, but primarily there to help manage viral outbreaks. But they're also, in English, when we say something goes viral, it means it's spreading quickly around the world, like a YouTube video or something. So we can say, also these EOCs are rapidly spreading. At first, there were just a few, like in Geneva or in Atlanta in the United States, and they're spreading quickly around the world. So these are viral infrastructures, and they're key sites where global health security is produced today, and that makes them very amenable to site ontological investigation. When site ontology investigates a site, it broadly differentiates between two elements or two components of the site. On the one hand, it says there are human practices that unfold at the site, but then there are also material arrangements that are present at the site. Within international relations, we've used site ontology a lot to study practices. There's the whole practice turn in international relations. We've analyzed even a lot of the practices that are involved in responding to infectious disease outbreaks. But I think we've spent less time looking at the other side of the site, especially in the way in which site ontology approaches it, which is the material arrangements, the things and the stuff that is present at the site. And so the move here again is it's a double move. It's to say, look, EOCs are key sites that we can analyze in terms of the production of global health security, but also we can actually use site ontology here to focus specifically on the material arrangements, right? We can understand EOCs as material arrangements. And this is the kind of entry point into the study of EOCs as infrastructure. And so I began to reread site ontology much more closely, not so much on the human practices, but actually on the material arrangements. And what I would argue is that within site ontology, we can actually find a kind of a theory of materiality that we can use to think about what infrastructure does. Because site ontologists like Theodor Schatzky, for example, they would argue that material arrangements prefigure social relations. Material arrangements prefigure social relations. What does this mean? So prefiguration in site ontology is to say that prefiguration is a kind of channeling power. Okay, it is the ways in which material arrangements make certain courses of action more likely and others less likely. It's a way of kind of conditioning future possibilities. It's a way of qualifying future paths of action. This, again, can sound quite abstract, but the nice thing about Theodor Schatzky as a philosopher is that he always has a good example to explain it. And so he invites us to think about an image maybe in the countryside. It could be in the Midwest of the United States of America, it could be in rural France, somewhere outside of Paris maybe. And he says, look, imagine a scene where you have a lake or a pond, you have some grass, you have some green hills, you have maybe a house, maybe a barn where you keep some horses. And he says, let's think about the pond. Let's think about the lake at the center of this picture. And he says, look, the lake makes certain courses of action pretty easy, right? So if you've been out riding your horse and you want to take your horse for a drink in the lake, it's very easy. You just take it straight to the lake and you have a drink. But if you want to return your horses back to the stable behind the lake, maybe it's actually more difficult because you have to walk all the way around the lake and you have to take a detour and it takes you longer than if you could go directly. So the lake has a kind of prefigurative power, or it prefigures social relations by making certain courses of action easier or more likely compared to other things. And this is the power, in a nutshell, this is the power of prefiguration. And this, I think, if this is true, then site ontology actually has a pretty important insight into the nature of power relations, because things, just by virtue of being there and how they are there, have a certain kind of prefigurative power. And so this is how I kind of build on site ontology to begin to think about also the power of these EOC infrastructures. And in fact, I would argue that on the basis of this insight about prefigurative power, we can actually open up kind of a new way of researching material arrangements. Because site ontology would argue that material arrangements always prefigure social relations along or across multiple registers at the same time. So with the case of the lake, we had made something easier, made something harder, but there are many different registers along which material arrangements can prefigure. And so we can begin to have a kind of way of thinking about material arrangements and infrastructures as material arrangements to begin to tease out how exactly particular material arrangements prefigure social relations. So to do this, however, requires a little bit of translation work. Site ontology is principally a kind of philosophical body of work, though more and more social scientists are also using it. And so part of what I do in the paper, which is the basis for my talk today, is that I also develop a kind of a methodological analytics for beginning to tease out this prefigurative power of material arrangements. So this is inspired and built upon site ontology, and it's a three-step process. So the first step consists of what I call site ontological inventorying. So in order to understand the power of material arrangements, the first step really is just to get a sense of what material things are actually present at the site. And you can do this through inventorying. So the first thing we did is literally go into EOCs and to list all the things that are present at the site, all the stuff that's there. And we broadly found three types of things. On the one hand, you have physical objects. As you can see from the photos, there's lots of stuff like furniture, office supplies, IT equipment, telephones, maps, flowcharts. So just a whole bunch of physical objects. And we began to list all of them, no matter how seemingly insignificant they might appear at first sight. We also found that these EOCs are immensely data dense, so they're full of data and information, like disease outbreak reports, emails, all kinds of data systems. And finally, of course, they're also full of human resources, full of people, full of experts. And these three things are arranged within these EOCs according to wider logics. And again, there's kind of three that are quite important. The first and the most obvious one is centralization, right? This is already reflected in the name EOCs. Everything in an EOC is kind of always built to face each other, ideally so that the experts can even have direct eye contact with one another. A second logic, though, behind these arrangements is continuity of operations, right? So there are many things that you find in EOCs that are there to ensure that they can survive and continue to operate during a crisis. So they might have special security arrangements to control who goes in there, but they also have things to control temperature, control oxygen so that people can work for long hours without getting tired. They might have backup power supplies, all kinds of things like this to allow for continuity of operations. And finally, we also found a third principle, which was very important to these EOCs, which is operational flexibility. So space is actually at a premium in a lot of health organizations. And so EOCs also have to be adaptable so that when there's no emergency, they can be used for other things, or they can be slightly adapted depending on different types of infectious disease outbreaks. So we inventoried all of these EOCs to see what is actually there and how it is arranged. We then undertook a second step called site ontological sifting. So site ontology also argues that material arrangements can impact and have particular effects, social relations. For example, an email alert or a new bit of data can provoke a reaction or cause certain activities to happen within the EOC. And so we went through a second step of site ontological sifting to tease out some of those as well. I won't go into detail on all of them because of time. There's then also a third step, which is site ontological contact tracing. And so this is important because site ontology argues that material arrangements can also form wider constellations. Okay, and so methodologically, this means you can't just look at what's inside an EOC. All the pictures that you see here are taken from inside an EOC. You also have to think about what's in between EOCs, right? What kind of connections emerge between different EOCs? And what we found here is that there's actually now a new global network called Eocnet, which is trying to network and connect all of these EOCs that are springing up in different countries around the world into one kind of global virtual EOC. This is called Eocnet. So these prefiguration analytics allow us to identify the three major axes of prefiguration that come out of EOCs. So just like the pond have particular effects, right? These EOCs have particular effects. I say there are three axes of prefiguration. The first is that these EOCs, just by virtue of them existing and by how they are set up, they make it easier rather than harder, right, to bring highly focused epistemic attention to global health emergencies and new outbreaks. That's their raison d'etre. That's what they're for. And they make it easier rather than harder to get a very detailed picture of these outbreaks because they bring everything together. So that's one major axis of prefiguration. The second major axis of prefiguration is that they also actually, again, just by virtue of being there and by virtue of how they are there, they make it easier to have a coordinated response to a new outbreak. Because whereas in the past, everybody was kind of spread out in different agencies and different government departments, you bring all the key people and all the key data points closely together in one place. The third axis of prefiguration is that actually these EOCs, just by virtue of their existence, also make it easier to have an international response, a coordinated international response, right? Because the fact that all these EOCs are being built around the world makes it possible to have also a kind of globally connected network of EOCs. So it also makes an international coordination easier. So these EOCs then bring about quite a significant what I call an onto-epistemological transformation in outbreak management. It's a new epistemological vantage point, right? EOCs are a new space from which you can begin to see and know outbreaks from within these spaces. But it's also actually changing at a broader global level what outbreak response is, because it's not something that's random or haphazard, but it's something that is distributed now within a global network of EOCs. So the question then poses itself, as I move towards the end of my talk, is what do we call this type of prefiguration, right? These three axes that come together. And it's here that we get to the notion of the oligopticon, which actually comes from a French thinker who only recently passed away, sadly, Bruno Latour. Latour is very famously known for his work on actor network theory, but he actually also did a lot of interesting work on Paris and on the city of Paris. And so he went around Paris and he described these little control rooms that were all found all over Paris. One, for controlling water, for controlling electricity, for controlling the traffic, for monitoring the weather, right? And he called these oligoptica from the Greek word oligo, meaning little. So he talks about the oligopticon, and of course he contrasts this with the panopticon, which Foucault talked about, which is this kind of ubiquitous form of power. And so Latour begins to develop a very different notion of the oligopticon in contradistinction to the panopticon. And so this is why, kind of borrowing from Latour, right? Latour also talked about war rooms, right? And EOCs. So EOCs are these kind of oligoptical infrastructures because they're focusing just on this one thing, which is new infectious disease outbreaks. Okay, and that's why we arrive at this notion of oligoptical prefiguration. Now, the last question before turning over to Dagmar then is, okay, Stefan, so why does all of this matter? You've taken us for half an hour and you've talked about prefiguration, you've talked about site ontology, you've talked about the oligopticon. Why? And so I think the importance of capturing this is that once you begin to see this power of prefiguration, you can, of course, also begin to think about what are some of the drawbacks or dangers with this type of power. So with Foucault, Foucault famously said, not that everything is bad, but everything is dangerous. He pointed to the dangers of panoptical power, the rise of the disciplinary society. This remains so important when we have all these information technologies and all the surveillance, right? And how people self-discipline in relation to all of this. So he talks about the dangers of panoptical power. This power tries to see too much. I would argue that there's a concomitant danger with oligoptical prefiguration, but it's the opposite problem. It's not the problem that it tries to see too much. It's the problem that it tries to see too little, right? So when we looked and we did further research into these EOCs, began to realize that actually these are often perceived by people as quite small silos. It's only very select and kind of elite people who get into these EOCs. They are also only able to see temporally the outbreak at the moment of the emergency, right? Which means they cannot see, excuse me, some of the kind of wider structural dangers. When you think of all the outbreaks that we've had, clearly there are structural things going on, but they are not captured because we focus only on the moment of emergency. And finally, of course, these EOCs only see particular types of health challenges, right? Particular infectious disease outbreaks. But in many other parts of the world, of course, in a sense, new infectious disease outbreaks can have an impact anywhere in the world. But for many countries, the overriding political priorities when it comes to health are actually more dealing with a very large daily burden of disease, rather with much more rare and sporadic infectious disease outbreaks. So there's a way in which this power, this oligoptical power of prefiguration, has its own kind of subtle patterns of seeing and unseeing, and they are foregrounding particular things and backgrounding other things. And I think this is what we can begin to capture through site ontology. So thank you for your patience and listening to me. And I'd like now to hand over to Dagmar, who's going to speak about a very different set of infrastructures.
There you go. The floor is yours.
All right. Let me try to share my screen. Does that work?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, first of all, for the kind invitation, Peter. Thank you for having me tonight. And thanks for the opportunity to talk about my current research, which is also about infrastructures in global health security. But as Stefan said, I'll address it from a slightly different perspective. I have less pictures, even though I really tried, and I have less theoretical sophistication. But I hope to bring some interesting stories to the table so that we have something to talk about. What I would like to focus on in my talk is how infrastructures shape the way we think about biological risks, and reversely, how the politics of security eventually shapes these infrastructures. So this mutual relationship between infrastructures and global health security, if you like. And I will specifically like to focus on the role of science, which itself can be seen as a less visible pillar of global health. But of course, scientific research has been absolutely crucial for public health, for global health. Key advances in life sciences in the past few decades, such as genetic engineering or development of biotechnologies, or most recently synthetic biology, have made crucial contribution to life sciences, and have also helped contribute to the fast production of the vaccines against COVID-19. So we need this kind of research. It is important for our societies and our health. At the same time, we hear more and more about life science, not only as a source of good and betterment, but also as a source of risk for our societies. And this idea that life scientific research can be used not only for good, but also for causing harm is not, of course, new. Almost with the very development of modern biology, microbiology, many states started to experiment with life sciences and try to weaponize life scientific research. And that's why we have, since already quite a long time, international legislation in place that prohibits biological weapons, development and use of biological weapons. Specifically, already in 1925, international community adopted Geneva Convention, which prohibits the use of biological and toxin and chemical weapons in warfare. Then in 1972, Biological Weapons Convention, which prohibits not only the use of bioweapons, but also the development, production, transfer, and stockpiling of them. And most recently, the UN Security Council Resolution 1540, which is concerned with preventing the spread of biological weapons, as well as chemical and nuclear, to non-state actors, and calls on member states to establish appropriate domestic controls over related materials to prevent their illicit trafficking. So there is a very strong norm against bioweapons. This is something that is not questioned, and it is a cornerstone of international law. However, there are two major problems. First of all, there is no legally binding international mechanism which would enforce compliance with these conventions. Especially the BWC has been seen as rather weak instrument. There is no international organization, for instance, which would really oversee the compliance. And second, and perhaps more importantly for the purpose of the talk tonight, there is a wide spectrum between weaponizing of life sciences on the one hand and having, let's say, safe, secure, and benign life science research on the other hand. And this gray area between the clear weaponization, militarization of life sciences versus having something that we don't need to be concerned about is what became source of multiple controversies, especially over the last 20 years. As Stefan already mentioned, very shortly after the attacks of 9/11, a couple of US senators as well as media received letters with purified anthrax, which means that the anthrax that was sent in these letters most likely came from some specialized military laboratory, because it's really hard to purify anthrax anywhere else. And the investigation of this incident was quite problematic. The potential suspect, who was identified as likely having sent these letters, was identified on quite indirect evidence, such as spending undocumented hours in a laboratory, and he eventually committed suicide during the process of the investigation. So there is not a conclusion really to these incidents. Another controversy came with the H5N1 research, or so-called bird flu research, where researchers started to enhance the transmissibility and pathogenicity of bird flu, which eventually caused controversy in the scientific community as well as beyond, because this type of virus would have no medical countermeasures. There would be no way how to cure if someone gets infected by this research. So the research was eventually halted and opened up a lot of debates on how far can scientists go with this type of research. And most recently, we have heard, of course, speculations about the so-called origins of COVID-19, with some scientists and some politicians arguing that COVID-19 is not of natural origin, but is a result of a lab leak, likely from the laboratory in Wuhan, or Russia recently calling for the international community to investigate alleged development of biological weapons by Ukraine, arguing that Ukraine has some secret bioweapons facilities funded by the United States, and this shall become a subject of international investigation. This was recently rejected by the UN Security Council, but just another example of how this research is becoming, through different channels, subject to security controversies. So, all of these stories I wanted to mention show that there has been rising attention to something that we can call biological risks over the past 2 decades. And especially the United States has been at the forefront of trying to formulate what biological risks are and how to address them. And most recently, this framework for biological risks was also adopted by the World Health Organization, showing even more attention to this issue, where WHO frames biorisks basically as a dual-use problem. And I will quote from a very recent report where they argue, scientific and technological advances in the life sciences and converging technologies can raise significant ethical, legal, societal, safety, and security risks. The same scientific information and technologies that can generate potential benefits for health and society could also accidentally or deliberately be misused and potentially cause harm to humans, non-human animals, plants, and agriculture, and the environment. This raises the challenge on how to develop and implement governance tools and mechanisms that mitigate the risks posed by life science research without hampering the development and use of such research for global health and society. Moreover, irrespective of whether risks arise from the latest developments in the life sciences or from well-established practices, all life sciences research and applications must be used responsibly. The word responsibly is of crucial importance because the appeal to scientific responsibility, responsible research, has been over the past 2 decades at the forefront of the attempts to address biological risks. And also, this is where the WHO suggests that the biorisks are managed, this kind of direction of scientific responsibility. Specifically, there are 3 pillars mentioned in the biorisk management: biosafety, laboratory biosecurity, and the oversight of dual-use research. And these 3 pillars, in a nutshell, focus on education, training, awareness raising of scientists and researchers working with these, let's say, high-risk pathogens. At the same time, there's also encouragement to develop best practices, how to secure laboratories, technically in terms of IT equipment, in terms of material infrastructure, so how to build solid laboratories that give no chance to viruses to escape. And finally, there is also an appeal to oversee dual-use research, which includes, among else, for instance, the appeal to journal editors so that they are aware what kind of research they publish. To put it simply, to make sure that they don't publish a blueprint for something that can be misused as a biological weapon. So this approach to biorisk management is something that has been at the forefront of the biosecurity agenda in the last 2 decades. And I think it does a lot of good, raising awareness, suggesting good practices. At the same time, I find this framing of risk is problematic from several perspectives. First of all, it focuses a lot on present situation, on research now, without really considering what preceded it. It puts a lot of attention to individuals, to individual researchers, to individual publishers, to individual institutions. So this logic of responsibilization, which I'm sure that you have talked about before in different contexts, is present here with all the problems that it usually has. And to some extent, there is also this discourse of science and technology as almost external factors to be dealt with. Science, scientific development as a weather that is to be forecasted rather than part of a society that we might have actually more control to manage. And this brings me to my suggestion how to think about biological risks differently. And here I must say I really like the name of this seminar series, The Geopolitics of Risk, because I think it nicely brings attention to the global and political context of risks, not just the individual, but what shapes our understanding of risks. And here I want to propose 3 pillars, how to rethink not only biological risks, but other in general. First of all, drawing on science and technology studies, I think we need to think about science as a part of politics and as a part of society. Politics influences science and science influences politics. And that's why biological risks are also intertwined with the development of life sciences, as well as with the broader paradigms and practices of security. Second, drawing on infrastructural studies, I believe we need to think about science not only as an intellectual endeavor, but also something that draws heavily on material and technological components and has strong material underpinnings, including, and this is what I would like to focus on further, research infrastructures. So research infrastructure is a complex social material arrangements are what actually shapes a scientific research. And finally, I think inspired by partly post-colonial research, but also STS research on the history of technology and parts of infrastructural studies, I think we need to have a look at the past and the legacies of past political programs and past political rationalities, which shaped how current science looks like, and which also shaped the research infrastructures, which we still live with. So to summarize this argument, I believe that when thinking about biological risks, we need to have a look at the research infrastructures in which the so-called risky research is conducted, and trace how they have been built, with what vision, with what purpose, how to secure the modern society from all sorts of insecurities, and how these legacies live with us in the present. And when adopting this perspective, one pillar which is traditionally quite overlooked, but also given the current controversies that I have talked about, becomes way more visible, are so-called high containment laboratories. These are microbiological laboratories that conduct research with the most dangerous pathogens. They are also called maximum biological containment laboratories or biosafety level 4 laboratories, because if you look at the picture, there are 4 categories of biological laboratories depending on the type of material, biological material they work with. And the BSL-4 laboratories work with the most dangerous ones, such as anthrax, Ebola, Lassa virus, and so forth. Now, according to the project Global Biolabs, run by the King's College London, there are currently 67 known such laboratories in the world. But what is perhaps more interesting is that the overall number is rising. Only in the past decade, 1/3 of these have been established, and more are planned to be built, or many are also renovated, and states invest quite a lot of money to upgrade them. The new ones are to be built, particularly in Russia and China. Now, I talked about the international governance of biological weapons. And this is because life sciences, as I've mentioned, have been weaponized. There is military history to biological research, to life sciences. And these laboratories, which are gaining popularity, have prominently very strong military roots, as well as roots in colonial policies, nationalist policies, and times where states prepare for different types of security challenges, such as total warfare. So, for instance, now, maybe just to explain, my goal now is not to tell the whole story of high containment laboratories. This would be impossible, not only given the time constraints, but through a couple of, let's say, snapshots. I would like to show how these laboratories, specific technologies, infrastructures evolved, and how the past might still inform what we live with in the present, which I believe is important for the understanding of the controversies that we are observing also these days. So, as I mentioned, many countries experimented with biological weapons. For instance, during the First World War, prominently Germany experimented with biological weapons, but they have not really been used in a large scale in the war. What was of key importance, though, was Japanese biological weapons research during 1930s, which continued also to the Second World War. This is what you can see on the first picture, when Japanese proceeded not only to research in laboratories, but to experimentation. And they experimented on civilians and prisoners of war, especially in Manchuria, the annexed territory during the Second World War. Now, this research ended with the Second World War, but the knowledge and expertise gained through this highly problematic research traveled further. It traveled to the United States, and it traveled to the Soviet Union as the winners of the war. And both United States as well as Soviet Union continued biological weapons, drawing on this expertise from the imperial Japanese research. United States eventually stopped the research on bioweapons, and they actually proposed the Biological Weapons Convention prohibiting the development of bioweapons. However, the Soviet Union continued bioweapons research, and it built, in fact, a massive project called Biopreparat. On the second picture, the one below, you can see one of the laboratories that were built as part of this large-scale project, which continued even after becoming party to the Bioweapons Convention. So there is the story of the military research. At the same time, the technological equipment that is nowadays used in high containment laboratories have roots not only in these times, but also in other policies, in other purposes. For instance, the US space exploration in 1960s gave rise to the development of all sorts of technologies, specific chemical showers, for instance, and protective clothes that started to be used in these laboratories. Similarly, in 1960s, research on so-called exotic diseases was also prominently funded and supported, which also contributed to the development of all sorts of equipments, technologies, and expertise on how to work with these high-risk pathogens. Now, when the Cold War ended, the attention to bioweapons decreased. However, after the anthrax letter incidents after 9/11, United States increased heavily the investment into biodefense in the anticipation of a similar attack. So it invested heavily in these biosecurity laboratories, creating, in fact, a lot of new opportunities for this research to be actually misused or become a subject of accidents. So on the one hand, there is this attempt to prepare for biological incidents, biological terrorism, but on the other hand, this research has also increasingly become a source of risk on its own. And as I have mentioned, there have been controversies related to experimenting with the pathogeneity and transmissibility with high risk viruses, which led to, among else, outsourcing a lot of problematic research to new countries, including, for instance, China. So there are a lot of research collaborations, international research collaborations, which support basically this outsourcing of research elsewhere. What you can see on the last picture, the one in the right down, is a picture from Biodefense Center in Těchonín, in Czech Republic, former Czechoslovakia. And I think this facility nicely shows the complicated stories that most of these facilities have. The Biodefense Center nowadays includes this biosafety level 4 research laboratory, as well as a military hospital prepared for dealing with patients infected by these most dangerous pathogens. However, the facility during the Cold War used to be part of the Warsaw Pact military program with unconfirmed yet highly likely links to the Soviet military program and the program Biopreparat, which I talked about. And going into even deeper into the history, the facility was built actually in 1930s as military barracks, being part of a huge defense border defense system in the anticipation of attack of Nazi Germany. So I think it nicely shows how different visions of security, how different visions of threat translated into this infrastructure and shaped how it looks like, where it is, what kind of people work there, what kind of technologies, what kind of expertise is there. And the same can be said about multiple other places, for instance, Porton Down, high containment laboratories, which was during the COVID-19 pandemic at the forefront of developing vaccines, developing diagnostics, has similar history. In 1930s, it started developing offensive biological program. Britain was also developing bioweapons. Then it switched to defensive research in 1950s. And nowadays it's a key part of the public health infrastructure, yet there is also this past of bioweapons. So to conclude, I talked about rising attention to biological risks and the need to look at the research infrastructures, the material technological underpinnings that actually enable the study of high-risk pathogens as a part of research on global health. And I think this is important because beside the developing practices to secure high-risk research against accidents and misuse, we also need to understand how this research became possible in the first place and what kind of scientific, technological, as well as political legacies it builds on. And this shall hopefully help us better understand as well as address the controversies that this research has become a part of.
Thank you very much. Thank you to you, Dagmar, and thanks to Stefan. It's the architecture of the two presentations is very nice. It really does. It really did sort of describe the objects in from two different angles. I'm very, very grateful for that, Stefan. Maybe the floor is open to all of you online as well. Si vous souhaitez poser une question en français, on peut bien le traduire. Maybe a little question from my side. First, to start things off. First, for Dagmar, you had these sort of double hypotheses that on the one hand, historically infrastructures have shaped society, and on the other hand, societal risks, perceptions of risk have shaped infrastructure. The latter is much more easy to imagine. Obviously, we feel threats, so we build walls or other infrastructural tools to address them. But the first one is really a bit very rich and interesting and evocative. How is it that sort of legacies, how do infrastructures historically leave a footprint on society? I mean, the laboratories we built to do research, that's your theme in particular. How does this sort of historically change society? Because it commands the discourse of danger and risk and then leaves it. It represents a kind of a permanent reminder of the risk or the danger. Is it that way that it leaves a mark on society, or is it more symbolically? Economically, I can also see that certain infrastructural investments also have a legacy. You know, there's many ways that can be understood, and I wonder if you might maybe be a bit more concrete on that point. And I can immediately then ask a question about for Stefan about my favorite new word, polygopticon. And I understood. I think we understood the basic definition: little control rooms, where little things are seen. A small-scale experience is had of the world, where small numbers of people are there. But what I want to invite you to maybe give a few more details on is how that changes the power structure. I mean, you contrasted it with the panopticon. Very nice, I'm sure, and that's of course what Latour was playing on too. But what is the difference between the way that power is understood in the little control room full of elites, crowded, and the panopticon, which looks outward and structures power by observing from a distance? So there's two questions, maybe, Dagmar, and then the floor is open.
Thank you very much. That's unfortunately the part which I didn't get to. So thank you for bringing it up. What are the legacies of infrastructures? I believe these are very multiple, and I don't have any predefined set of this is what to look at. But what I'm trying to point out to is that when studying security politics, the politics of risks, there are usually certain paradigm shifts moving to the era of thinking of fluid risks, for instance, and I talk about cold warfare and Cold War and like these big times of thinking about security and threats and risk in a specific way. And I think that when we look at infrastructures, we explore the practicalities of that. So when you prepare for a certain threat, let's say the invasion of a neighboring country, you build specific infrastructures, material, you build the walls, you train people, you say these are people who are responsible for security, you train them in a specific way, you build institutions which communicate with each other, you finance these institutions. So you build a whole network, social, material networks. And then, even though the thinking on what is a threat, what is insecurity might change, I try to argue these infrastructures are still in place. And some of these aspects of these infrastructures are, of course, easier to adapt to the new thinking, but others might be more sticky and might bring us back or keep reminding us, whether symbolically or very practically, about the previous security paradigm. And coming from being very, very practical, personal, coming from a post-communist country, the Czech Republic, and growing up in 1990s, I basically saw this firsthand when all these Cold War communist institutions were transferred. People who used to teach Russian were basically overnight trained to teach English. And the same happened in the security area, right? People who used to prepare for certain type of threats were suddenly sent to the US to become active members of the Western security community, and they were supposed to prepare the country basically for adopting the NATO framework for understanding risks and threats. And I think this is not only a feature of a country which undergoes such a political U-turn, but as I have mentioned before, we have gone through all sorts of paradigm shifts of thinking about security and threats. But at the same time, the type of people that deal with these problems, the type of institutions that we have built, the very practical networks that exist are there. And I think we need to look very practically on the ground how this actually shapes the way these threats and risks are addressed.
So interesting. Thank you. Yeah. I really like the word sticky. I mean, and I wonder what the factors are. So I'm sure it's very contextual what causes the stickiness and what things, some things are more sticky than others. I couldn't help but when you said it at first, it's a bit simple and a bit provincial. No, my brain was simple. I meant that I flashed the bunkers at Normandy on the beach there, that they're still there, they're so massive, they'll never go away. And this was an infrastructure that also determines the way we think about, in a completely useless way, think about threats today.
Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah, and some of these infrastructures, some of these legacies are just there for displaying the past threats, as these bunkers. Some of old weapons go to the museum and remind us this is the past threats, and that's it. But many of these, I believe, are repurposed, rebuilt, and this is where the interesting part begins.
The stickiness part.
The stickiness.
Some are more transformable than others.
Exactly, exactly. And so I don't have like any universal methodological tool, but I believe that we shall pay attention very practically how these past legacies live with us through these infrastructures. And I think the infrastructural analysis is helpful in revealing that.
Stefan, do you want to tackle Polygopticon?
Yeah. Thank you for having the courage to say the word, Peter.
Twice I said it once now.
Thank you for always asking difficult questions. So so I suppose the starting point is the conventional kind of Foucauldian approach, right? And especially the middle Foucault, who talked so much about disciplinary power and who looked at, actually also he looked at designs, right? Just like we saw some pictures here of designs of EOCs. He started with Jeremy Bentham's design of the prison and the kind of this guard who stands at the center and can view the entire semicircle of prisoners. But no prisoner knows, whether they're being surveilled or not. And of course, this is classic middle Foucault, and his critique was how this leads to the kind of the pervasive disciplining of society. The critique lives on because we have so much social media, information technology, surveillance, etc. And ultimately, of course, then into the late Foucault in terms of how that the subjectivization and how the surveillance leads to kind of internal and self-disciplining. Latour was different, of course, and he started talking about oligoptica. And when I say he started talking about oligoptica, there is no big book by Latour on oligoptica. There's no big article, but there are actually quite a few sporadic references across his work. And he was really interested in these small control rooms from the point of view of actor network theory, because these are the spaces where all the relations come together, right? So if you want to track the relations between things, these kind of dense small rooms are perfect sites. If you want to understand capitalism, look at the trading floor. If you want to understand military, look at the bunker. So that's how he became interested in oligoptica. My interest is, I love the word, and it captures so well also these EOCs, right, which are also these bunkers and these small spaces, and how it's different from Foucault. It's not this kind of wide-ranging gaze, but it's like a telescope, right? It's like a very specific, just focusing on these outbreaks, right, and all the stuff that kind of goes with it. So it's a very different kind of power. Latour never took it really anywhere, this oligoptica. He has these references, but what I tried to do in the paper was to kind of consolidate them a little bit, to kind of to draw out a slightly different economy of power that's different from the panopticon, but then to also link it back up actually with the Foucauldian question of what is the danger here? Not that it's bad, but what's dangerous with this type of power? And what I feel and what I argue is that the dangers of oligoptical power are different from panoptical power. And not only are they different, they are, in a sense, the exact opposite. Whereas the panopticon tries to see everything, and all the kind of dangers come from that kind of way of seeing. The oligoptica, like the EOCs, just look at this one thing very narrowly, very specifically, with a very high degree of granularity. But it's a different pattern of seeing, but it's a different pattern of seeing that has its own problems. And in my view, it's that it ends up actually seeing too little. So we have these EOCs. There's a very small kind of elite in there with not very many different voices or perspectives, and a lot of people are actually not even allowed to go into the EOC. But it's also that it just sees it just sees these infectious disease outbreaks at the point of emergency, right? It's only when the crisis starts that they kind of become activated. But we've had so many of these outbreaks over the past 20 years alone that you have to be quite suspicious that there are wider structural reasons that is generating this increase in the number of outbreaks. And these deeper, wider structural things, of course, this kind of oligoptical type of seeing doesn't get into. And then finally, from a global perspective, maybe not from Paris, maybe not from London, but taking a global health perspective, there are many other countries around the world where what we call global health emergencies, right, or outbreaks, are not actually the biggest health challenge that they have to manage. They're still dealing with a very high day-to-day burden of disease, insufficient healthcare infrastructures, insufficient staff, et cetera. So, and none of this is seen by EOCs either, right? They're there just to catch these outbreaks that have the potential to go around the world. And so it's not that they're bad, right? But that there is also a danger associated with this particular form of seeing. And the danger is that it ends up seeing too little.
Did I hear you correctly to say that that there's also a phenomenon of which I say self-replicating incestuous error, when you have a bunch of elites in a small room making decisions, that the errors they make are reinforced?
Yes. So one of the big problems, absolutely. So one of the big problems that we found is that you can actually, the space, right? It's so dense, it's so concentrated. It gets its own kind of dynamic, and you can actually get discrepancies between, because these people are not out in the field, between what's happening out in the field and how things look inside the EOC. But actually, there's, since you mentioned now this kind of more affective dimension, one of the things that's also really interesting about these EOCs is, so one of the things that I said at the beginning is that whenever I would go to a prominent health organization, I would always get invited to go see their EOC. They would say, Stefan, you have to see our EOC. And I was made to feel special that I would be invited to enter this thing, and not everybody gets to see the EOC. You have to have security clearance to get in there, and it's kind of like the nerve center. And so I began to realize that actually this kind of showcasing of these infrastructures was actually a really important part of them. And one of the photos, for those who were looking at the slides, you can also see, for example, that from the one in Atlanta, they bring in people, journalists, public health from Africa, and they show off their big state-of-the-art EOC. And the idea, right, is that that people visit, they are impressed, and then they return back to their own country and want to build an EOC in their country as well. So there's a kind of affective dimension. You might even say kind of like a mimicry, right? So then they say, oh, well, they have one in Atlanta, we have to have one here as well. And so then they begin to spread around the world. And as they begin to spread around the world, right, then it becomes easier to just connect them with, IT infrastructure, Teams, Zoom. Once the EOCs exist in different parts of the world, it then becomes possible to connect them. And all of this at the extreme, right? When you think about, we in global health, there's always this problem about infectious diseases that don't respect borders, that can quickly spread. But politically, we have an architecture that's built around states. How can you get states to cooperate? And we have all these, we have attempts to have international law, like the international health regulations. We have attempts to build new institutions, like the World Health Organization, but the successes are limited. And so what we actually have, infrastructure, nobody is looking, but what we actually have here is a different infrastructural way of trying to improve coordination through the use of infrastructure. You build the infrastructure have to be manned by expertise. You connect the expertise, all of a sudden you have a very different strategy for managing infectious disease risks.
And then the problem of interoperability, right? Just
Yes.
all that. Very good. Oui. Vanessa. C'est pas la peine que je répète.
Thank you. So I speak. So do you hear me? I had two questions for Stefan. I'm not sure it works. Does it work? Yeah. Okay. So I had two questions. Two quick questions. The first question is you emphasized the fact that it was like the defaults and not only the defaults but the characteristic of this type of organization with EOCs. And you showed to us a benchmark of EOCs around the world. So is there like countries, because there is a large level of diversity in terms of political organization, economic choices around the world, is there countries that didn't go this way? And if not, how do you interpret it? Do you think that there is like some kind of necessity for this type of organization, despite the defaults of this type of organization? And if there is countries who did other choices, what are these choices? And the second question is, it's not really a question, it's more like a reflection, but I felt by hearing you that there was like somehow, it's a bit presumptuous to say it this way, but a confusion between two different, especially by seeing the pictures, two different sites, sized more like situation rooms with very high level people, ministries and top leaders around the table taking decisions, and EOC, as you said, with more like hundreds of civil servants working on their computers on various issues. And regarding the second modality, the one with hundreds of civil servants and a big screen, I don't understand really the point about elites gathering and top leaders gathering to take high level decisions regardless of the granularity of the situation, because in the case of hundreds of civil servants working, they're not like representing some kind of elite. They could be described as representing the technique of the power and the idea of a technocracy, but they don't embody the various kinds of power, economic power, social power at once, which would be a description of elites.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Should I answer straight away?
Sure, go ahead, Stefan.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Those are both really excellent questions. Thank you so much. So on the first part, there are, there are very few countries, as far as I'm aware, that are actively saying no in principle to an EOC. But there are constraints that a lot of public health organizations face that may prevent them from setting up their own EOC, and these are often resource constraints. So for some institutions, and we were surprised at how big an issue this was, is space is at such a premium. So many health organizations are underfunded, and sometimes at my university we struggle to find an office for a new colleague because we don't have enough offices. A lot of EOCs, they also don't have the space to just have a whole room sitting there for when there may or maybe not a new international emergency. Other countries just don't have the time and the resources to invest in creating this. And so there are two responses to this. One is that some countries who have a strong interest in this are making funding available, often primarily through bilateral means, and they will send teams and funding over to other countries to help them build their own EOC, and they can borrow from the operating procedures and from the design blueprints of already Another response to this is that we're actually seeing a diversification of the types of EOCs there are. So, you know, at the fringes, an EOC doesn't always have to be a room. We've seen some cases where an EOC was only a filing cabinet. You know, it had some files about what to do in the emergency and what they would do, but there was no need to actually maintain a room just for this. And in some cases, there are even attempts to build a kind of a mobile EOC that you can have on a telephone, you know, with all the key kind of operating procedures. But even where countries do build EOCs, you know, we've also seen some issues and challenges around local adaptation. So what you begin, you know, the first EOCs very much come out of the kind of Anglo-American understanding of public health. So, you know, prominent example, the biggest EOCs, you know, is the one in Atlanta for the US CDC. It almost looked like it looks like a rocket launch. You know, they have 200 stations there and many auxiliary rooms. It's a massive operation. The one in Geneva is big. But as they spread around the world, there are many problems of local adaptation, because of course behind this infrastructure, in a sense, is also a particular understanding of health and public health, and that doesn't work seamlessly in all contexts. So one of the interesting things, if you go to Vietnam or if you go to Ethiopia, is you know, what adaptations do they have to make to try to adopt these principles to local conditions. But just, I mean, even just through WHO, you know, WHO at its regional headquarters will have EOCs in all of its regions. So there is, at least at regional level, kind of comprehensive coverage. And then many countries have a national EOC, and increasingly we're also seeing countries having multiple EOCs, right? They might have more local ones spread across areas, especially if they're zones where they are particularly susceptible to new infectious disease outbreaks. In terms of the second one, the question about the EOC, yeah. So I think, you know, you get into situations where you have to look at also the kind of political and the legal context. So the EOCs that we are looking at are often primarily, it's not so much political leaders, but it's public health experts and leaders. But there's still a certain kind of elite sense to those. It's the top kind of officials who get to go in there and who get to have access. And of course, even if the decision makers are not there, that information and that data flows into the things. And so one of the things when you look at the blueprints and the designs of EOCs is that the issue of not just how you design the room, but where you locate it, where you site it, is actually also an important consideration, because you want it to be close to all the major powerful decision makers. So even if the elites are not in the room, they tend to be in close proximity to where the EOC is. Thank you.
Thanks, Stefan.
There has to be one in Paris somewhere as well. You guys, maybe one of you can find it.
Yeah.
That could be homework for everybody. Find the Paris EOC for outbreaks.
I think Jan, our colleague, has knowledge of this kind of thing, actually.
Not for EOC, but other crisis rooms indeed. But I want to follow up a little bit on the question, and I also maybe talk to both of you. Well, first of all, thank you very much. Very, very interesting presentations, both of you, and talk to me on so many levels. But I kind of noticed that you take slightly opposite conclusions from both of your cases, whereas you insist on kind of the, I would say, local heritages and the impact on those, well, globalized science, globalized laboratories. You rather insist, Stefan, on the more global side, on the different axes of, well, I would say centralization, standardization of those practices and techniques. And maybe in your case, Stefan, I was wondering, to what extent is the local creeping in? To what extent are those boundaries keeping the exterior, the environment, environment out? Are they successful or not? To be more concrete, while watching your slideshow, I could not help to notice that you have, of course, a lot of things that are in common in all those rooms, but you have a richness of different materials and interior designs and ways to arrange the tables, people inside. So does it really work, this hermetically closed environment, or to what extent is there a local anchoring that is very, very important and very powerful? And I would go the other way around in the case of your presentation, wondering about the standardization of equipment. Speaking about the material conditions, I was wondering, seeing the picture as well and having seen other pictures of those laboratories, also the classification you mentioned about the different levels of risk and threat. Who produces those centralized norms? Are they effective in kind of erasing those legacies and deterritorializing them, delocalizing them, lifting them up on the more global level? By the way, I might add, I'm very much interested in volcanic observatories and what they have they have a lot of things in common as what you mentioned as well. Especially they are often shown to outside visitors, ministers, heads of state, etc. But they have a very important difference. They are built in a way that you can see at any moment the outside, because the idea is to have the dangerous object, the volcano,
You can watch the lava coming
in view. So they're quite literally observatories. You're observing all the time the outside. So at any standpoint, they're very much similar in the interior design. You have those central tables and you have the screens, etc., and telephones, but you should see the outside. They don't have this strict boundary, and that's why I'm wondering also about this locality creeping in. And at the same time, they're also part of those global geological observation networks on an international level, and there are those small control rooms you mentioned. But they are also using a lot of standardized material and a lot of standardized methods who mainly come from the US. So I was wondering about this part as well. But thank you again. Very interesting.
All right. Thank you for an excellent question. Actually, I must say, when Stefan talked about the EOCs, especially when he responded to the last question, I realized that biosecurity labs are quite the opposite of EOCs. They were made to be separate. They were made to be secret. Very often, the old labs are built somewhere in the mountains, somewhere far away. It takes ages to get there. For instance, in Switzerland, Laboratoire Spies in the mountains, Porton Down, far away from London. This laboratory in Tiechonin, there's no reasonable public transport connection how to get there. All of these places are far away from urban population, because of the potential risk that these laboratories can have, and also because these are, for many people, like suspicious facilities. So they have been built historically in places where you don't have much resistance for all sorts of reasons from the local population.
It's not for safety.
Partly for safety, but partly because for resistance. Like in the Czech context, it's in a borderland, and you can say it's basically like a post-colonial area where historically there used to live German population. Then they were expelled after the Second World War. So it was kind of a territory of no one. So why not build this military facility there? Because there wouldn't be a strong resistance, right? So while EOCs are kind of made to be connected, I would say the biolabs struggle with this connection. And this is what we see nowadays. There are attempts to collaborate more, but I would argue that these histories made it hard. If it's military-run facility, they are not made for sharing information. They're not made for having collaborations. So all those very practical things then come to, there are many obstacles at these very practical levels. And I would argue this is precisely because these facilities have different history. At the same time, as you say, there is, of course, equipment which is becoming way more centralized and is produced by global like companies with global outreach. So this is definitely the centralized part, like for instance, the protective clothes that you can see in all of these facilities that's usually produced by a couple of companies in the world, as well as many other parts of the equipment and the technologies. But the buildings, the people there, and as I've said, like the institutional ties, the personal networks, that's a different story. And this is where I find that the tensions interesting. This is where I would argue that they kind of come in.
Did you want to?
Yeah. So I can only build on what Dagmar has been saying, and also say thank you for the question. I wasn't aware of these volcanic observatories, so I'm really intrigued by them, and thank you for sharing that. And they sound like oligoptica as well. So I want to know more about them. So maybe we need some prefiguration analytics to see exactly how they prefigure differently from EOCs. But in terms of your substantive question about the local, the local always creeps in, and really what we need for this also would be, anthropological research, to tease this out. But to give you some examples, in some places there are fax machines in the EOC, and I was like, oh, what are you doing with fax machines? It's a bit past. I don't remember the last time I sent a fax. But actually, it turns out that internet connections in many parts of the world, of course, are not very stable and might not be resilient in the case of an outbreak. And so you see fax machines as the kind of the more resilient backbone of communications during an outbreak. And in one of the EOCs, there were life vests. And we know, what are life vests doing inside of the EOC? And you go, yeah, well, because they have to. It was a low-lying country, and they had to be resilient to flooding, and so they had life vests in their EOCs. And in one EOC, we found when we went in there on the walls, there were all these party games, like bingo, and I was, what does this have to do with an outbreak? And they're like, well, yeah, but Stefan, when we don't have enough space in our offices, when we have Christmas parties, when we have social events, the EOC is the only big room where we can actually gather all together and so the EOC has to kind of double function as a social space, or even where they do job interviews, because they can look quite flashy and professional. Another EOC was, they put a huge emphasis on having water coolers. And when we asked them about it, turns out that this is not just about hydration. Hydration, of course, is important when people have to work very long shifts, and so you want to control people's hydration, you want to control their fatigue, so their temperature control systems, et cetera, et cetera. But what they realized was that the water coolers were actually absolutely critical to communication. So people would have these kind of water cooler chats in the midst of a pandemic, where they would exchange vital information that might not otherwise flow very naturally. So kind of in different local contexts, there are always different objects in the EOC that have greater or lesser significance. And I think the inventorying, that first step of the prefiguration analytics, that helps us a little bit, because you just go in and you begin to catalog it all, and then often you're surprised at what you find.
Thanks.
There is a question, Peter, also on the in the chat, but I don't know if.
Yeah, can you see it, Stefan? Is there an ELC world governance?
Yeah, I think that should probably be EOC.
EOC.
Yeah, so there isn't, because there is no, in international relations, we don't have a centralized or world government. And this is precise. We have this thing called the international health regulations at international level, but even these this is supposed to be our kind of flagship piece of international law to govern outbreak reporting. But we saw during COVID-19 that many of the provisions of the IHR were routinely breached by countries all around the world in terms of travel bans and that were imposed and things like that. And again, many countries don't have the resources to be compliant with IHR. So the At the moment, there are attempts to have a pandemic treaty, but it's unclear where those negotiations will end. What you have for EOCs at international level is something called Eocnet, NET for network for short, and it's run out of Geneva. And this is simply an attempt to kind of create communication channels through all these EOCs that you now have popping up in different countries all around the world. And so it's precisely as one of the questioners put it, they have standard operating procedures, they have standard recommendations for what should go into an EOC, they have design blueprints and so forth. But it is, along with kind of quite conventional international relations, it is a kind of voluntary association. So it's a kind of it's a normative governance about setting standards and procedures, but they can't really tell any country you have to have an EOC or how they should design their EOC. That would always be up to individual member states, right? But what I think is interesting about, of course, is if you can get enough countries to build an EOC, then all these EOCs are going to be staffed by people and by expertise. And if you're clever in a fairly low cost way, you can begin to constitute a global community of emergency practice, right? That just by networking all these EOCs that are cropping up. So it's a very different way from using international law or from building big diplomatic institutions like WHO. It's a very different way of trying to solve this problem of improving international cooperation for cross-border health threats.
Excellent, thank you. Perfect timing. There's not anyone else online who wants to ask something or comment? Yes. Thank you. That's a very good comment. That was my comment as well. Thank you very much to our two speakers. Please join me wherever you are. Thanks a lot, Dagmar, for the experience of the strike you're going to have tomorrow. And next week, dans la semaine prochaine, sécurité énergétique. Donc, il y a des vulnérabilités là-dessus, autour de ça. Merci.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup.